I'm Dr. Donald Guy Generals, President of the Community College of Philadelphia, and you're listening to the True Philadelphia Podcast with Matt O'Donnell.
Dr. Donald Generals runs the largest institution of higher education in Philadelphia. The Community College of Philadelphia has just under 30,000 students, all aiming to earn a 2-year associate's degree, possibly to transfer to a 4-year college, possibly to get a job right away. Dr. Generals has seen it all, having been educated at William Patterson and Rutgers universities, receiving certificates in education and leadership at Harvard and Cornell, and having worked at Mercer County Community College, the former for-profit Catherine Gibbs Schools, SUNY Rockland, and Passaic Community College. Our discussion was wide-ranging, from the high and continually rising expense of college, the future of higher learning, the current generation of student, the skills needed to succeed, and successful leadership. We spoke at his office at the Mint Building for 45 minutes, which is quite long for a podcast interview, but if you listen, I think you'll agree it was worth it. Dr. Donald Generals, right now in the True Philadelphia Podcast. Dr. Donald Generals, the president of the Community College of Philadelphia, and we're seeing a brand new school year start, and I'm wondering if you are like teachers in public schools where you're counting down 180 days.
Absolutely. 180 days, 8 months before we go back to Fridays off. This is a great time of the year. It's exciting. The energy at the campus is palpable. I don't know that you know, beyond this campus, we also have 3 regional campus centers around the campus. So I've had the opportunity to go to all 3. And in each case, students are excited. The faculty are excited. You know, the weather is great, so
weighed down with books, walking around, getting to class.
Books. You know, the lines are minimal. Typically, this time of year, you have a lot of lines and a lot of anxiety about trying to get through the process. But I think we've been able to minimize that. And students are in class, and things are actually starting to settle down now. We're going into our 3rd week. We actually have another semester that will start in about 3.5 or 4 weeks, our 10-week semester. So, yes, we're very excited.
I want to talk in general terms about college and its expense. And I know here at the community college, you're at the lower end of cost, and I think that you would probably tell me you're at the higher end of value. But generally, and this is a question that parents and everyone else always ask all the time, and I think no one's really cracked it because they keep asking the question, why is college so expensive?
That's a good question. I think the colleges that are expensive have a lot of history, a lot of years. They have accrued cost over those years. And then I think the competition to try to provide students with, you know, what I would refer the Disneyland experience. You know, there's
the food, the athletic
there's
facilities.
A lot of superlatives that not superlatives, but, you know, extras that really have very little to do with education. And I think that's part of it. And I think, you know, the costs are real. You know, you have salaries, you have contracts that you have to adhere to, the cost of equipment, the cost of technology. You want to keep pace with the technologies that are there. You want students exposed to the best technologies, and those technologies cost, and the same is true with the community college. As we move more and more into the career and technical fields of study, those costs can be prohibitive if you don't find ways to support them through the various channels that we have. So the costs are real. You know, you have salaries that are real. The environment, the dorms, the food courts, and all of those things, the prices add up. With all of that said, I do think there's an element of inflation that goes on with higher education. I think some of those costs can be contained, and some colleges are starting to do that. And I think eventually it's going to be probably the biggest disruptor in higher education.
Yeah, I want to talk about that word, disruption. And before we get to that, the one thing you didn't mention that a lot of people think is one of the biggest drivers in the inflationary cost of education is the wide availability of federal loans, which have a lower interest rate, although, and a lot of people don't realize this, in a bankruptcy, you cannot erase a loan for education. But because it's so easy to borrow, doesn't that give a lot of these universities, colleges, an excuse to keep jacking up the price higher and higher?
I believe it does. I think parents and advocates for students are beginning to get wise to that. Right now, the debt is 1.3 or 1.4 trillion dollars. On average, it's about $37,000 a year per student across the country. And I think people are becoming more and more aware of community colleges and the cost and our ability to transfer students into these cost-prohibitive institutions, whereby they will have saved at least 2 years of those tuition costs.
Sure.
So yes, I do think there was there was a license to continue to jack those prices up because they knew that the revenue source for students was limitless.
But you think it's coming around now?
I think it's coming around. I think it eventually will balance itself out. I don't think it's fashionable to have the highest tuition in the country anymore, where at one point it was. People.
What about, I've heard stories of some schools where they would lower the tuition and their admissions rates would go down too, because people are like, oh, well, if this one isn't as expensive as that one, then it must not be it's as good.
Exactly. It's like
buying a car.
Anything else. You took the words right out of my mouth. People, there is sort of a natural proclivity to believe that there's value and cost and the highness of the price. And I think people are beginning to realize that that's not the case. And you can look at the bare numbers. Right now, half of all the undergraduates in the country go to a community college. I'd like to believe that's because they've recognized the value of the education that they're going to get, and they ultimately will. But I think most of it has to do, or a lot of it has to do with it recognizing the cost. And there is no real value added in going necessarily to an institution of higher ed that's going to cost $70,000.
Yeah, well, let's give an example here, a real example. It's about $11,000 to get an associate's degree,
right.
And that's for the entire year, right?
Years, that's correct.
All right, so for the 2 years.
Well, an associate's degree.
Associate's degree, and so $11,000 per each year.
No, $11,000 for the entire.
Okay, so $11,000. That's 2 years, and then you go down the street to Drexel University.
Right.
A single year, $70,000. Right. The cost disparity is enormous, and you cannot tell me that the quality is that different too.
Right. The relevant quality, I love John Fry. He's a great friend of mine, so I have to be careful what I say to my colleagues around the city. But I guess my answer to that is that, in a very practical sense, that student who will pay $11,000 here, if they're a good student, they can get into Drexel. And because we do have articulations with Drexel, then they'll get a scholarship and they'll be a rising junior when they go to Drexel. I'm not going to debate whether the calculus they get here is is qualitatively equal to the calculus they'll get at Drexel. I believe it is. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in business because we're measured by the same accreditors. We're all regionally accredited, so we have to maintain the quality. And you're absolutely right. I mean, that's pretty self-evident. And I think students are getting it more and more quickly than the professionals are getting it. The disparity in the cost.
Because they're the ones who carry around this debt.
They're the ones who carry around the debt. And, as quiet as it's kept, students are quite, they're quite intelligent.
They're vocal.
And they're vocal, and they vote, and they understand the world around them. And especially our students who have to overcome so many impediments, just to get through basic life's circumstances in the worlds that they come from. They're very savvy and they're very wise in their ways. And so they recognize the difference in those costs. And, they're looking for a quality education. They're not looking for name recognition, or they're not looking for, a trophy on their shelf. Relative to the
some people think the bumper sticker can be a driver, and maybe more so with the parents, like, hey, I go here, look at me. How much of that do you think is involved?
I think that's a lot. It's the flags on the walls, the Michigan University, it's the Stanford. There's certain symbolisms behind the schools and the institutions. They're great institutions, don't get me wrong, and they've got a lot of rich history to them, and they've produced a lot of great individuals. But I think higher ed, as we know, is really changing into something other than it was even 50 years ago. Community colleges have come around roughly 50, 55 years ago. There are some that are much older, but for the most part, we're in our nascent stages. And I think that's driving the changes in higher education, whereby the top-tier universities are no longer going to be able to continue to command the prices that they command, because ultimately it's a large part of their revenue is driven by tuition, and they're going to have to change. So you see that happening in Pennsylvania right now with the state schools. The state schools. They have serious enrollment problems, and I believe a large part of that has to do with the costs that they're placing on their tuition, and students are choosing to come to community college. They have other choices.
A middle-class student can't necessarily go to some of those state schools, Westchester.
That's right. They can't. Westchester, happens to be one of the ones that's doing okay, but some of the ones in
and they charge the most.
That's right. In the more regional middle areas, they're struggling, and it's I don't want to say it's a crisis, but it's getting to the point where it's a crisis. Something has to be done.
Should community college be free?
Yes.
Who's going to pay for it?
I think that that same question was asked back in 1919 when people asked the same question about high school. Who's going to pay for it? I think it's a public good. We have to figure out a way to reorder our priorities and consider community colleges as part of a K-16 model of education. I think it's, I don't want to say it's effectively free now, but given the amount of financial aid that students can receive, and in a lot of states have last dollar tuition scholarships. We have a last dollar scholarship. There are opportunities where they can come and not pay anything. They can get.
It essentially should be just 13th and 14th grade.
I don't want to say that because that has a negative connotation. It is higher education. It is college, but there is a continuum from secondary school into higher ed. But that's not all we do. As you know, that's probably maybe half, maybe 2/3 of what we do. A large portion of what we do has to do with the returning adult. Students that were out in the workplace or that were at one of these 4-year institutions and didn't do well, and now are trying to restart their educational experience, and they come here. So we have, a lot of part-time students. We have evening students. We have working parents. We have an online division. So it's not just you finish high school and you come to college, although we do have a large portion of that. We're much more comprehensive in terms of the populations that we serve. We are involved more and more in dual enrollment. So a lot of students that are still in high school are coming to us taking college level credits. Last year we graduated, I believe the number was 9 or 10 students from Mass High School who actually got their college degree before they finished their high school degree. We graduate in May, so they got their college degree.
That's putting the cart before the horse.
Right. Well, that it's changing. Higher ed, as we know, is changing. And if you look at the history of higher ed, it has always changed. And I think we're in the throes of a change now. We're moving into a new epoch of what higher education is and what it will represent. We have a middle college program with Parkway Centrals. Those students started in the 9th grade. They're now in the juniors, and when they graduate high school, they'll also receive their associate's degree from here. So it's changing, and it's not just here; it's changing around the world. If you look at the literature on higher education in Great Britain, there's the Bologna study, whereby this whole notion that you have to do 4 years of high school before you can start college is just being eradicated.
So I'm in an industry, the media industry, that is still experiencing massive disruption. Social media, iPhones, the availability of information on the internet. The newspapers are dying across the country. Some say that it's creating news deserts out there. It's having negative effects. Education is totally being disrupted right now, but not to the extent I think that media is. So maybe we can start the conversation on that this way. How much should a college experience be virtual, and how much should it be in person, in buildings, face-to-face with teachers?
I think that's a relevant question in that the demand for education is changing. So it depends on what your desire is. Not all industries require a 4-year degree or even a 2-year degree. Not all modes of education or teaching and learning have to occur in a classroom. So I think what we're seeing now is the demand for education is moving away from what the traditional structures have been, and there's enough demand for innovative means for innovative and creative ways to provide learning based on knowledge that you need to know, as opposed to just this sort of broad notion of what constitutes an education. And I think there are enough students who are voting with their feet in those directions. So you have online instruction, you have MOOCs, you have virtual colleges and universities. You have colleges and universities. We are a microcosm of that disruption that you're talking about, because there are some traditional professors and faculty who will argue that it all has to occur in a brick and mortar setting, versus those who believe we can extend it by way of virtual teaching and learning.
It sounds like what you're saying is we can make the college experience tailor-made to the individual,
exactly.
And we need to be flexible in how we can deliver it.
Exactly. I think, the supply is driven by the demand. Students are looking for a means to get into a profession, to get to a job. Those professions and jobs are now they're now responding to the notion that you don't have to have 4 years of an education. What we want you to know for this job is this thing. So it really is about competency-based learning. It's about, in some cases, prior learning. It's about what you know in order to be able to do your job, in order to step into your profession, as opposed to what type of degree that you have. That's becoming more and more of the reality in this world that we live in. And so as that grows, of course, institutions are beginning to provide more and more of that supply. So, for example, we have, micro-credentials in our workforce space. Not all tech companies need a person who has a AS degree in computer science, but they may want someone who understands
some skills,
machine learning, for example, or someone who has a fair grasp of some levels of artificial intelligence. So we can pull that out of the curriculum, which we do, and prepare them for those particulars. We have individuals who have degrees already in one of the social sciences, or I don't want to disparage English as a profession.
I'm an English major.
All right, so there you go. And you're doing journalism now. And they're able to come to us and get the very specific, narrowly focused skills that they need in order to get a job in communications, or in our case, it's nursing. Sometimes it's accounting. So we're moving away from this notion that a college degree is the driving force. It's the skills that you have and that you need that are becoming more and more of the driving force.
I always joke with people that I became an English major because I understood the language.
There you go. I was a political science major.
That was my minor.
It had nothing to do with higher education, but you kind of find your way.
Yeah. I think with English, you learn how to read, comprehend, and you learn how to write. And writing is it's very important for my industry, but it's such an important thing that you can do in just about every other industry.
And writing drives your thinking. It enables you to be creative. So I don't mean to belittle the importance of general education, because that is important, and I think creative educators can find ways of integrating the two. The very narrowly focused skills along with the sort of general education, quantitative, qualitative thinking that you have to have, because ultimately you have to be a good thinker. We don't want to just train people to turn a widget. We want them to be able to have the skill sets to do that, but also the mindset to be able to understand when that particular job changes, or when it's time for you to create some type of stackable credential journey towards another profession or field.
One more thing about disruption. What has not happened yet in this disruption of education that you foresee happening in the next couple of years that maybe is not really on anyone's radar screen?
In a wide scale way, I think it's going to be probably in the world of virtual education. I think artificial.
You're talking about holograms?
Holograms, exactly.
Really?
I think
hologram teachers.
Hologram teachers. You open up a software package and the educator pops up and you have your very own classroom. I do think that's the case. I think the virtual reality world, VR, virtual reality world is becoming very, very prominent in education now. And I think it's just a matter of time before it gets separated from the institutions. And
you could have Tupac be the professor. He's famously a hologram for a concert.
Exactly.
I'm not exactly joking about that, because maybe a class is more interesting with a virtual professor that may be a celebrity who may have been able to record a hologram.
And then you can create the environment. You can have classmates around you, and you have the professor there, and there's real learning objectives, and it's all right there in your house. I think that's a possibility. I don't think it's going to be the totality of higher education, because ultimately part of educational experience is interacting with your peers and your colleagues, and whether that's in a chat room or somewhere, you need to be able to speak with individuals. But I do think there's a real possibility. In large part, you kind of see it happening now with YouTube and some of these other media, whereby you can learn things in a sort of virtual reality setting. That may not be the classic definition of what virtual reality is, but it's in many ways same thing. Yeah.
Are we trying to entertain this generation that's in college too much? I feel like everyone has to be entertained to pay attention to anything nowadays.
I believe education should be fun. I think I think you should have an opportunity to experience the fun parts of professional life. It's not all doldrums, late nights with just you and a light. I do think there are parts of our humanity that require that we have some outlet for fun and expression, and to the extent that we're teaching the whole student, we want them to have a whole life experience that includes valuable educational opportunities and objectives. I think it's a good thing. Now, do we do it too much, which was your question? I think that varies. I think some schools do. I think, and I have to be careful in saying that. I think the idea that you have to go off on campus and have the party life with, the fraternities and the sororities and things, which is something I never had, is not necessarily the equivalent of a college experience. And I think in that sense, you could argue that it's too much, that it's a distortion of reality. And
the public opinion on that type of lifestyle at college definitely is turning. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly, and it's dangerous. I mean, you've just seen the tragedies that have happened in higher education usually happen when 18-year-olds who are way too young, and I'll sound like the old curmudgeon grandfather, to be off on their own drinking and partying with no oversight and no supervision. And in most cases, theoretically there's RAs and there are people there. But by 18, you've become pretty savvy. That's right, and you can do many things on your own, and you can get around whatever supervision they've put in place. And I don't think that extreme, and I want to qualify by saying those are the extremes, are really good for higher education or educational experience. And what happens often, and we see it often, students go out and they party for a year, they get no grades, they've wasted about $50,000 to $60,000. In the best case scenario, they haven't defaulted on their loan, so they can come to us and we can kind of restructure and resalvage. But in most cases, they've defaulted on their loan, so now they can't even get financial aid, and they can't even.
The
come to us.
setback is enormous.
It's enormous. So that's 10, 15 years that they've wasted because of that 1 year of unsupervised partying, basically.
This comes up, this idea of snow plowing parents. Are you familiar with that term, or lawnmower parents? This idea that they plow through everything so that there's no chance of the child to fail, and then when the child gets to college, they have no idea what to do. Do you see this happen when you have freshmen come in?
We do. We do. And there are FERPA rules. We put a stop to it where we can when the parent steps over the line and wants to advocate. I'll use the more
advocation, yes,
for the student, for their child. And I get it. My wife's a little bit of a helicopter mom, and I have to tell her,
that's the level below the snowplow and the lawnmower.
I know. Yeah. So but the reality is, you're right. They're not doing them any service by eliminating the hurdles, the barriers that they're going to have to navigate, and the problems that they're going to have to solve on their own.
Why do parents do that?
I think
other than they love their children.
I think it's the extension of the helicopter mom. They just grown into this, and no one. And at the K-12, they're allowed to do that. You're expected to do that. I mean, there are differences, so you're expected to advocate. So we see that often in students with some level of disability, some level of challenge. At K-12, parents they're on it. They want to know what the accommodation is, who's providing the accommodation. They'll sit in the classroom. But here, you cannot do that. The student has to advocate on their own. And so we find students who've never done it, have no idea how to do it, and now they're lost in this big environment and just don't have the fortitude to be able to advocate on their own. And so we do have counselors that help them along the way, help them to make the transition. But we fight against the parents who are still there and think they can just come in and plop down and walk.
Sure.
The extremes, we kind of allow it, but the student has to advocate for themselves. Mm-hmm. And when you go to college, it's complicated because you have financial aid, you have registration, you have to schedule your own time, you have to,
sleep.
You have to sleep, you have to balance your time, you have to figure out when you go into the library, and nobody's going to hold your hand. So we don't hold hands. We provide pathways and opportunities and support, but you ultimately have to advocate for yourself. And the student that hasn't had that experience struggles.
on the other side of the coin, do you think whether it's a school at the high school level or a college or a business bringing a young person in, do you think society has become a bit more accommodating to those who are just more needy? And not in the sense of having a disability, but just this sense of neediness. I need you to give me an hour coffee break because I just have to gather my thoughts and go back. I mean, do you see that?
I would. So the students that we serve don't have that luxury. Oftentimes, they've not had that experience. They've been much more self-sufficient. Even the ones that have your traditional so-called family structure, usually the top of that structure is a little bit dysfunctional. So they've had to survive, and they've had to be independent thinkers. They've had to find their own means for getting through the days oftentimes. And, that's, it's a bit of a stereotype, but that's what we're dealing with.
And does that build character?
I think it does. I think it builds character. I think it builds fortitude, and we take that into account. So students come here and they have to test on a basic skills test to get into various levels of college. And I've always said, the student that might be marginally deficient, we want to take into consideration that they've got this character, that they've balanced life, that they've managed their brothers and sisters, or they've had to deal with the vicissitudes of life. Mm-hmm. At a very young age, and I think that same quality and skill will enable them to overcome whatever academic deficiencies they may have, and we need to give them a chance and support them to to get through successfully. So I don't think that kind of advocacy, I'm looking for a better term, but I don't think that they've had that type of luxury or privilege whereby they've been able to take advantage of opportunities of individuals saying that I just don't think they've had the opportunity to take advantage of what you've described in terms of being.
Or maybe how about this? In a general sense, some suggest that as a result, partially of parental involvement, that getting a high school degree somehow is easier than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. Is our education being dumbed down to make sure that kids get more A's?
No, I don't think it's being dumbed down. I think there's always a little bit of that in the mix, but I think the broader problem has to do with some of the social economic factors that go into a large public institution. The advantages of being in a school system where the student-to-teacher ratio is much lower than what you have here in Philadelphia, I think are extreme, and the outcomes are pretty self-evident. I think the quality of the buildings, the quality of the resources. I think I'm a proponent of. I'm against the idea of property-based taxes paying for the school district.
Yeah, because it's funny how the cheaper taxes, real estate taxes, are usually in the better quote-unquote school districts because there's more money there, there's more industry to support the schools, and so the richer families get a tax break, basically.
Right. There's a larger tax break, and I think the public schools are a result. The qualitative nature of the public schools are a result of that tax break, and I don't think you can ignore that fact. And then there are other factors.
Before you move on to another point, do you think it should be a state income tax to pay for schools?
I know in Jersey, I don't think the same is the same with this whole concept of thorough and efficient education. States have a responsibility, and of course that's a political debate. Sure. I do believe that the states have the ultimate responsibility of ensuring a quality education
and to level the playing field across the state.
You can't go by the taxes of a particular resident. Philadelphia has a lot of services it has to provide compared to some of the places that are in the more rural areas.
Every student is more expensive.
Every student is more expensive. So I think in that sense, the pressure to get students through can result. I don't want to use the term dumbing down, but I think it can result in diverting and reducing the quality. I think there's some of that because there's so much pressure on test results, as you know. There's so much pressure on graduation rates. But I do think there's a lot of quality going on. That school across the street, Masterman, is always up in the top 4 or 5 schools in the state. So I think the there is evidence that public education in a large urban environment can work, but you've got all kinds of other things that go along in the picture that you can't tease out. And their cities have got 26% poverty rate. The children from
they go to school hungry.
They go to school hungry. They're in the school districts. They can't afford a lot of the amenities that go along with being a rising student in a learning environment. They may or may not have parents that support them. My son is very fortunate. He's got two professional parents who, are right there every day, but many kids don't have that. You have the high levels of parents that are in some level connected to the criminal justice system. The whole, the numbers of returning citizens that are out there struggling. So I think it's a mixture of factors that go into bringing the quality down. But at the same time, the administration and the faculty, they're really trying to push up against that. And, do they turn a blind eye to the most perfect result on a test or the most perfect outcome on a particular learning outcome? That could be the case in some instances, and you've spread that across the city. A conclusion could be that there's a little bit of watering down.
Okay. I have some kind of more rapid-fire questions.
Okay.
What's the greatest skill you need to succeed? And maybe something that can be applied to just about anything.
The greatest skill? I think you hit on a little bit of it. I think good English skills, good writing skills.
Right, English.
Yeah. English as a general education, not necessarily a discipline. I think you have to be able to speak, you have to be able to write, communicate. That gets you through a lot of things. And I think good speaking, writing, reading skills can enable you to solve problems and spread into other areas if you choose to do that.
Okay. What college degrees, majors should be more popular that are not?
Obviously the STEM fields. I think that as a society, we don't put enough of an emphasis in STEM, science, even though it's all around us. We've partitioned it off as a standalone discipline, and I don't think we've found a way to teach it where it's inspiring and to show that it's connected to our life in the world around us. Unlike other cultures, we have students who come from some, I don't want to say third world, but places like India and, maybe I'm stereotyping.
Emerging countries.
Emerging countries where the students are phenomenal. That's all they want to know. And math and science is a language. We don't look at it as a language. It is a language. It's an expression and understanding of the physical world and physical properties
math,
around us.
everyone can understand, no matter what language you speak.
Right. And it's symbols. So we don't teach it as a symbol, as a language to understand the world around us. We teach it as a one-dimension abstraction. And that's been, I think, part of the problem. So it's a universal problem in this country. When you look at the numbers worldwide, the United States really doesn't do well in those fields, and we need to do better.
Which college degrees should be less popular? Where are we overloading?
Good question. I don't want to say English because I just said it. I think.
How about? You hear a lot of people getting into this analytics field. Do you feel like there's too much of a push to try and solve everything through analytics and not through? I don't know if it would be sort of just a internal decision-making process. Like you can just take baseball as one of the first examples to really emerge with Moneyball.
Right. So I think the larger problem is the proliferation of disciplines. I think something like analytics or, many of the math, there needs to be much more integration, much more of an interdisciplinary approach towards life. And what happens is you have PhDs in everything. So the PhDs, they come to college and they create their own little sliver of expertise or specialization, and it then becomes a program. And then, it's not really attached to anything in particular. So we're teaching that particular sliver of knowledge. I think the students that come out of there are somewhat restricted in what they could do.
If everyone has a PhD, then there are no PhDs.
And there is a school of thought that's part of, to get back to the public education issue, that all the best and the brightest are going into higher ed graduate school to specialize in some narrow sliver of knowledge, as opposed to becoming teachers in the broad fields of knowledge and learning that is needed in the public schools. That's not to say the public school teachers are the fault, so please don't quote me there. But I do think there is that argument that the proliferations of doctorate degrees and PhDs in this country is part of the problem. It has inflated what's genuinely important to the life of our society.
That's the beauty of a podcast. You can actually explain yourself. It's not like a 10-second soundbite and people can misunderstand it. So make sure you listen to this whole thing, all right? I want to talk. I know that this is not an issue here, but the legacy. I went to Harvard. My son gets an easier. I did not, but that's just an example. I went to the University of Delaware. So then my son has a better chance of getting into Harvard. And this has created an issue with admissions. You have the court case with Harvard. Should the legacy be eliminated and moving the merit side of things up a little higher in admissions?
I don't think it should be eliminated. I think that's an extreme. But I think it should be less of a consideration relative to the merit. So that's my professional opinion. My social justice opinion is that the emphasis on selectivity in Harvard, Penn, and the Ivy Leagues,
the academics,
right, I think is part of the problem as well. I think it only exacerbates. I know this is going to be very controversial. I think it exacerbates the wealth equity gap that we have in this country. If you're tied into whether it's a parent or a community or a school district that really prepares you for the best, for the Ivy League schools, that only, it becomes self-fulfilling in many ways.
You win the lottery basically at birth.
You win it at birth, right? Now, of course, the controversy of people stacking the decks so that the kids can get into these high-tier universities, speaks volumes to where we are as a nation and putting so much of an emphasis on getting into these institutions. But I think, especially the Ivies, were born out of a very elite, very exclusive society where only the wealthy white men went to school. Women didn't go, and I think there's certain elements of that still are pervasive in those colleges and universities, both in terms of what it takes to get in there. I think, I like Amy Goodman, but I think Penn's admissions is 5%, 6%, single digits, whatever it is. And I believe that education should be the benefit, should be the means by which society improves itself and makes itself, equal and provides opportunities and access for everyone. So if you want to view them as the best, we have to find ways to make them less selective than they are, so that the diamonds and the roughs can get in there. I always throw Hazim Hardeman out there. I'm going to owe him a ton of money by the time I get finished using his name. Do you know about him? So he went to Temple. He went to school. Well, he wanted to go to Temple. He lived right across the street, and that was his dream university, and Temple wouldn't accept him. So he came here. He got into our honors program. He graduated from here. He went back to Temple, and then he became a Rhodes Scholar. He's a Rhodes Scholar.
Great story.
It's a great story.
Yeah. So
that's, to me, is the prototypical story of a community college, as well as the prototypical story of having a selective criteria, a set of selective criteria that either says yes, yay or nay that you get into this institution. I mean, he clearly had the ability to He should have gotten into Temple.
Yeah,
he should have gotten into Temple. He clearly, we're great, but we don't perform magic. You don't become a genius in 2 years. So he had the ability, and Temple just missed it.
Yeah,
and I think the same is true with, Harvard's, Browns, the Ivy Leagues. I think I don't understand why you have to be so selective. They must have physical room for people to come in.
Most of these institutions can give out free tuition for decades and still have plenty of endowment money left.
Absolutely. And it becomes self-perpetuating. So, a place like Community College of Philadelphia, we're not getting those $1 million gifts from graduates of CCP, which is the case in Penn, Harvard, Stanford, and so on and so forth.
It's a snowball situation.
Right. It's snowballing effect. Exactly. And I think, when you add to that 400 years, 300 years, or whatever it is of history, it's just
hard to beat.
It's hard to beat. Yeah.
So you're a leader of an enormous organization.
Mm-hmm.
How do you, and this is sort of a management question, how do you get people to do something they may not necessarily want to do? How do you motivate?
It ain't easy. You try to lead, you try to have a vision, and you try to craft a vision that has an element of practicality related to what we represent and try to do as an institution. And you try to draw a connection between our institution and the needs of the community and the communities that we serve. And you try to enable that vision to, to have some relevance to the life of some of the things we're doing and how that can ultimately enable us to reach our goal of providing opportunity, access, social justice to the community. So it's about creating a vision. I think the vision needs to be tied to some specific goals and objectives. I think you have to articulate that vision on a regular basis. You have to craft a level of credibility by being there and being on the front lines as much as you can. I think I try to have direct communications with staff, faculty, students, and the community, so you have many audiences. And I think the totality of your efforts can hopefully inspire enough people whereby they follow you on their own, and you're not forcing anyone to follow you. So unlike other places, other organizations, other institutions where by virtue of your position you have a command, you're able to put on command performances and people are supposed to follow. In my case, I think you have to, you can put on a command performance, but you can only hope that people will be willing to follow you. And then you throw into the mix, contract negotiations and a whole lot of other things, and it can tamper down, it can distort, it can divert. But I think ultimately you have to look at the total picture and see where you're moving, how you're moving, what kind of responses you're getting from students, what your outcomes are, how the community is responding to you. And you come away with an assessment of how well you're able to be that leader.
I hear from some leaders that sometimes it can be very lonely, being on the top. Everyone thinks, oh, you're on the top, well, everyone loves you, and everyone wants it. But it can be very lonely in the decision-making process and just the whole idea of what you're doing. So how do you deal with that part of it?
Yeah, I mean, it's lonely, and you're always taking risk. I mean, it's lonely because you're taking risk. And as you take risk, you're alienating a lot of people sometimes half the audience that you're communicating to. And so how do you deal with it? You have to have other aspects of your life that you enjoy. Having a great family and wife, somebody you can go home to, that helps. Having other interests helps. I'm not a one-beat pony. This is my profession, and I think I have the best profession. I built this to be the profession that I love. You hear the anecdote that if you don't want to work, get a job that you love, and that's really what I feel like. I have a job that I love, and my personal, social, professional are all embedded in this job, as well as the ones before. As a vice president, it's the same thing, but certainly as a president. So I think having other interests, constantly keep renewing your energy, constantly finding new values and ideas relative to what you're doing. So reading, you have to read a lot. I'm not the smartest person. There are people that are out there writing some incredible things about life and society and higher education. So I think renewing your own sense of life and philosophy and ideas is part of how you constantly rejuvenate your ideas, and I think that helps. You come in on any given day and you feel like, let's turn the page, I got new ideas, let's go in a different direction. And I think that right away raises the energy level up.
Oh,
but I think if you go into it knowing that it can be lonely, it's not lonely. I think Shannon likes me.
His assistant.
That's right.
Taking some video.
I think there are enough people that support what I'm doing and what we're doing in the direction that, and that. I don't have to state it, but you kind of get it, and I think that gets you through.
One more question.
Okay.
Do you have a favorite teacher? All along, a teacher that you had as a student.
Do I have to name one? Let me name two.
Sure. Okay.
Two. And it's funny, I'm going to name two because one of them, who's 90 years old, contacted me. She's been retired. She's writing a book, and somehow she found me and asked if I would give some stories. But Dr. Ruth Carter Hayes in Paterson, New Jersey, which is where I'm from, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, I had her. And of course,
still contact her, or she still contacted
me.
you.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't heard from her in 50 years.
Wow.
But she got in touch with some of the other classmates, and she contacted me. And at the time, she was one of these teachers where, when I found out I had her again, I hated her. I was like, you got to be kidding me, not again. But she was the teacher that would walk me home if I got a C. She would walk me home and explain that C to my mother, and she kept me close to her breast at that time.
She cared.
She cared. And at that time, growing up in Paterson, New Jersey, there were probably 5 or 6 of us who were hanging out. We played football. We did a lot of things. And I would say out of the 5 or 6, there's probably 2 of us that are still living. The other ones who weren't in her orbit got into all kinds of really bad things early. 13 years old, 14-year-olds.
You met
drugs.
her just at the right time.
I met her not that I would have gotten into drugs, because my parents would have hammered me, but I think she made a difference in keeping me on the right path. Mm-hmm. So when I went into high school, high school is foundational to what you ultimately do in life, and I think she made a difference.
That's neat.
And then the second person was Dr. Dan Tanner, who was my dissertation advisor at Rutgers. At a time when I was struggling with standardized tests to get into the doctoral program, he knew what my skill abilities were. I had taken class with him, and he went to bat for me in a very important way. And I think my understanding of progressive education and the relationship between education and society and the needs and interests of the students were very clearly described for me, and that's kind of the driving philosophy that I have right now. So Dr. Dan Tanner, Rutgers University, Graduate School of Education, and Dr. Ruth Hayes.
I hope they're both listening right now.
Yeah.
Oh, hi.
Hello.
Dr. Donald Generals right here on the True Philadelphia podcast. Thank you, Dr. Generals.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. I appreciate your time.
Our thanks to Dr. Generals for his time. Thanks for listening to the True Philadelphia podcast. We have so many more episodes worth your time, featuring the people who are moving and shaking and advancing the Philadelphia region. So please subscribe and pass this along to any of your friends who love podcasts. I'm Matt O'Donnell. Stay true, Philadelphia.